This is Research Like a Pro, episode 46, Scandinavian Research with Jenny Hansen. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of the Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast. And I'm here with accredited genealogist Diana Elder. Hi, Diana.
Hi, Nicole. It's so fun to be here today.
We're especially excited today because we have a special guest, accredited genealogist Jenny Hansen. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, you guys. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for coming on. So first, we wanted you to tell us about yourself, maybe how you got started with researching and how long you've been doing this kind of thing and so forth.
Okay, well, I have a degree in family history and genealogy from Brigham Young University. And I immediately after finishing that program decided to go for my accreditation while I was still in study mode. And a year after I graduated, I received my accreditation. And this summer actually marks 20 years that I've been accredited, which makes me feel very old. And I am not that old. But I have been doing this professionally for a long time now. And it's been really interesting watching how the industry has changed over the years. When I first got onto this, it was all microfilm and still reaching out to repositories for different record groups. And now, I mean, like everybody knows, you can do so much online.
Yes, that is really true. That's interesting because we started about 16 years ago. And so we started right when the internet became a big repository for genealogical records. And that's where we got our start. Although we did do a lot of microfilm as well, but...
Well, we went to the family history library and, played in the books and used those a lot too. And that was great because Ancestry was just starting and we could get some things online, but not like it is today. So Jenny, I just wanted to know, what was your accreditation in?
Great question. Yes. So my research specialty is Scandinavia, and I am accredited in research for Denmark. So all three countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, are very closely related, but Denmark is definitely my area of expertise.
Oh.
So for accreditation, I'm just not familiar with like all of the European areas. Is there a separate one for each one, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden?
Yes, there actually is a separate accreditation area for each of those countries. So kind of like in the US where we see all these different regions where there's expertise, then there's similarities across them all, but a little bit of difference that requires you to hone your skill a little more for that area. It's kind of the same thing in Scandinavia.
That makes sense because as a Gulf South researcher, I do tons of research in Mid-South, in the Central South. So same type of records, same methodologies. So,
and I'm sure that you feel 100% confident in those other areas too, because it is so similar.
Yeah.
But you still have your home region.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for kind of clarifying that. I don't know that I've talked to another Scandinavian researcher, an accredited genealogist for a while. So,
there's really not that many of us. And unfortunately, there's kind of this older generation that are the ones I look to and totally wanted to be one day. And they're starting to be out of the industry. Some of them have passed away. And it just makes me so sad to think of this incredible wealth of knowledge that is leaving. And then I think, who's going to fill it? And then I look around and think, oh, that's me. I've got to step up my game and become that person. I'm definitely working on being better than I am already. And Diana, you probably know this from going through the accreditation process yourself. Just because you've become accredited does not mean you know everything.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because that's absolutely true. In fact, it's funny because I just renewed my APG membership this morning, and it says that you need to make sure you've done 12 hours of education a year. And I was just laughing because I listen to stuff all day long. I probably do 12 hours in a week of education.
Yes, I think that if you are actively involved in genealogy, especially as a profession, there's no way to avoid the education aspect of it. Not that you would want to. I think that's a delightful part of it, but you just realize how much you don't know the more you get into this.
Absolutely, which is why it's so fun doing it professionally, as all three of us do, because every project you learn something new.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter if you've been doing it forever and ever. Every project has something new that pops up that you have to learn about and research. So it's fun. That's why we love what we do, right? We're constantly learning.
Yes.
I just have to say that the last project I've been working on has been in Slovakia, and I have been learning Latin. And it's been really fun to learn Latin because that's what those church records were kept in back in the 1880s.
Well, and Latin is such a useful language in genealogy.
Yes, for sure. I'm glad I got that project because I've really enjoyed it.
That's great.
So let's talk a little bit more about you, Jenny. What is your family like and where do you guys live?
So I live in Utah, about 40 minutes south of Salt Lake City in Utah County, for those who might know the area. I am married and have 4 children, and we are in the thick of it. I have 2 kids in high school and 2 in elementary, and just marching to the end of the school year with all we've got. And I love doing research. So I get to this point of the year and always panic a bit thinking, how am I going to balance my time in the summer when I have children at home rather than at school all day? And I don't know. If someone has the secret to that, please let me know.
Oh, me too. I'm so glad I'm not the only one who has that panicked feeling right now because we only have 2 weeks of school left here. And yeah, I'm not sure what I'm going to do because we're going to be doing a lot of swimming and
Yes.
it's just a lot busier than it
Yeah.
is when the kids are gone at school. So
Yep.
take a step back with the research. I'll probably say no to a couple projects and just say, come back in July when my kids go back to school. Luckily, our summer here is pretty short. We have year-round school, so we just have 6 weeks and then they're back in school.
We are traditional schedule. We also only have 2 weeks left of this year, but then everyone's around till August. So
It's a longer summer.
it's great and terrible all at the same time.
Yep, exactly. All right. Well, Jenny, tell us about your blog and why you named it that way.
Honestly, I have a very newborn blog. I have to be straight up with that. I'll just give the whole experience on that. So I came home from Roots Tech this year, having made closer friends with people like both of you, as well as many others, and just felt so motivated to finally get my blog going. For years, I've been dreaming of this, had all these content ideas, and I've just never pulled the trigger. So that was my massive takeaway from Roots Tech, is that I was going to make this happen. So my blog is called My Favorite Ancestor. And the way I came about that title is through the story of my favorite ancestor, and it's featured prominently on the landing page. But essentially, the story is that this woman who I just love is one that our family never knew about and had kind of a tragic life. So she was the first wife of this man that I'm descended from. And in the time of their marriage, she had 8 children, and none of them lived past infancy. And she herself died likely due to some issues with childbirth. She never had any living descendants. No one ever knew about her because there were no living descendants. The way that I even discovered her story was through this sound, deep research that I had trained to do in college. And through doing that, found this whole great story that is just rather inspirational for me and one that I cling to. And I thought, that's a great way to honor her and this situation and all the research practices that I've come to really hone and include in all that I do. Because if I hadn't done all this great research, I would have never found her. So the point of My Favorite Ancestor is to tell all about different aspects of Scandinavian research and just different methodology in particular that you really need to hang on to if you want to get the whole family group. I have some fun things on there too. I've just recently started doing like a cemetery spotlight with some cool headstones. I have lots of pictures of churches throughout Scandinavia. Scandinavia is just a place that my husband and I love. We both have a lot of ties there, and he actually lived in Iceland for a short period of time as a missionary for the LDS Church. And we have gone back to Scandinavia numerous times together. So we've got all these collections of fun photos I'm trying to share. And in the meantime, I provide somewhat of a glossary of terms that people should know and just a lot of details about how to get going on your research. Research in general, but really in particular Scandinavia.
I think that's great. Do you know if anyone else is writing any blogs on Scandinavia? Because I haven't really heard of anyone doing this type of a blog. So I think you might be, kind of the pioneer in Scandinavian blogging.
I kind of think so. I would agree with you on that. like I had mentioned before, there's this class of amazing researchers who are kind of fading out, but they're like that older generation who were not really embracing technology tons, and they could research up a storm and they can read any crazy Scandinavian document that you throw in front of them. I mean, there's not even books out there. So I feel like there's a hole that I can fill.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we have a little fragment of our family tree that is Scandinavian, and I have to admit that I have not really attempted research on that because it is one of those lines that has been pretty well researched, and so I tend to focus on my father's line because that's out of the South where there's tons of holes and nobody's working on it. I, however, had the opportunity to go listen to Jenny in person several years ago. We were having a local Scandinavian family history class, and for 3 weeks in a row, I got to go hear her talk all about how to do Scandinavian research, and I was so motivated and excited to try it, and it actually sounded really, really fun and doable. So I'm so excited we get to now have you on the podcast so that you can share everything, kind of give people just a little background in case they felt like me. Like, I don't even want to touch that because that sounds really scary.
Sure. And I'll just say the two things that freak people out first is the language, because it's different and the handwriting is that old Gothic script. So reading the records can be really challenging. But the other thing that really panics people is the naming patterns in Scandinavia. They are just not what we are used to, especially as Americans, but even modern Europeans. It's a very different way of thinking through naming. Rather than having a surname that sticks with the family for generations, they practice patronymics, which is the father's first name or the father's given name being used as the surname with either son or daughter attached to the end. So, for example, if Christian Peterson had a son, his name would be whatever they chose for the first name, Christensen, rather than passing Peterson from generation to generation.
Yeah, that is tricky, but I'm guessing that once you know that, you can use that to your advantage.
Oh, absolutely. And really, I personally, and maybe it's just because I do this all the time, but I don't think that it's that much more complicated than chasing a surname. It's a different way of thinking that you have to look at the given name and switch it back and forth from generation. And it really is very doable, just a different way of thinking.
Okay, so let's just kind of start right at the beginning. For somebody, let's just pretend that Nicole and I don't know anything about this. What's the first step? What do we do first? We have the Scandinavian ancestor. What do we do first?
So, like all research going back into Europe, you have to know where your ancestor came from. You've got to have that place of origin in mind. And just saying, well, I know they came from somewhere in Denmark, and Denmark's not that big. Like, that's a terrible answer. You're going to have the worst time trying to locate where your ancestor came from. So, you want to look at all those US records and exhaust those to the point that you can figure out where they came from. Places like the immigration records are probably the best, although our ancestors came over and settled with people that they knew here in the US as well. So, in particular, all through the Midwest, where the Scandinavian settlers ended up, they still met in churches with congregations of people that they knew. So, you can look at those church records and it will tell you where the person came from. Once you can find either a town name or a farm name, you got it made.
So you said a farm name. Tell me about that because I'm not familiar with farms being named and staying the same name, I guess.
For sure. So I know in a lot of places, not so much again in the US, but a lot of places in Europe, their homes have a name to them. And I know this is true all through the UK and other places where you might even just have a small cluster of homes and it's named something. So think of like a very small town that's only 5 or 6 cottages area. I don't know, something like that all grouped together. But the parish is definitely like the place that you want. But if you have the name of this smaller town, you can figure that out. And that was a situation in my family. So my dad's grandfather immigrated from Denmark, and everybody knew where he was from because he told everybody where he was from. And it was just the name of this farm, which was Sonderox.
Mm-hmm.
So looking in a gazetteer, honestly, you could probably do it online today. I was able to figure out which parish boundaries Sonderox Farm lies in.
Oh.
So the gazetteers for Denmark or the Scandinavian countries give those farm
For
names?
sure. You'd be able to locate those. And in fact, you can do that on Google Maps now too.
Oh, really?
Well, I've come to find that I use Google Maps a lot in my research. I don't know that I can actually put the farm name in, but if I put the parish in and I'm looking at the map, it has all these little farm clusters named all around.
Wow.
So it's a really useful tool.
That's wonderful. I love Google Maps. I use it all the time because sometimes I just want to measure how far one parish is from another and just see how close they are. And that's really neat. So I have a question. You mentioned Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. What about Finland? Is that also considered a Scandinavian country?
That is a great question, Nicole, and I get asked that a lot. So, the traditional definition of Scandinavia is Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So, it's that main peninsula that Sweden and Norway are on, and Denmark shoots right up into it. So, those three countries had a lot in common because of proximity. They were interacting with each other a lot. Their cultures, their languages, their records, everything's very similar. Now, if we expand the term and call it the Nordic countries, then we start pulling in places like Finland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, all of these other areas that kind of constitute that whole area, far northern Europe. The main reason why Finland isn't totally pulled in here because the Finnish language is crazy. It's actually more closely associated to like Hungarian, which those countries are nowhere near one another. So the language is different, the culture is different, and Finland, sometimes Sweden was in charge of Finland, sometimes Russia was, sometimes Finland was Finland. So in those years where Sweden had a lot of control over Finland, you could group it in with the Scandinavian countries because again, the language, the records, all of those are closely tied in. But Finland is kind of a standalone. It's a tricky one.
Well, that makes sense that the language being so different would make it a little bit harder or just a little bit separate.
Sure.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I think we can go back to our beginning in Scandinavian research now that we took that little detour.
For sure.
So, find the place of origin is so important first. Then let's jump into record types. What are the record types that we would then search for once we get back to that place of origin?
Well, there's a few that are really common, but there's one that's like the big one. So the main record type for all of Scandinavia is the church records. Scandinavian church records are amazing. And this is a time when we have a state church. And really, just up until recent years, the Lutheran Church has been the state church of the Scandinavian countries. When we talk about a state church, that means that this church kind of operates as a branch of the government. The priests are paid through taxes. Tax money supports everything going on in the churches. And the big one is those church records are the vital records. So you're not going to be able to find something like, say, civil registration that you see in the UK or other types of state vital records. But those church records, they are going to record christenings, which are the time of birth, marriages, and burials. So you get the three main events right there. And there's some other things that come into play with those church records as well, but your big three are right there. And I really think you can do at least 85% of your research just in the church records alone.
So I have a question. What is the challenge then with church records or with Scandinavian research? Because church records are readily available and so much information. So there's got to be something that's kind of hard about this whole thing.
Reading
what would
those
that hard
records
thing be?
Those can be really challenging. And
Okay.
if we wanted to get into the naming patterns, that can get really challenging too. So we have Gothic script, which is tricky to read. You get better at it the more you do it. And unfortunately, there's not some secret pass on how to do it. You just have to practice. So once you get better at that, it gets easier. But there's still times that I'm thinking, wow, this is handwriting. This is terrible. So I don't know. That's the big challenge on it. And like we had said, those naming patterns can be really tricky. So we talked a little bit about the patronymics, but the other thing to remember is that there's only about 10 given names for both men and women within Scandinavia. So you see these jumbled up in all sorts of different orders. But one kind of joke question that I always like to throw out when I'm teaching classes is how many people in this room are related to Hans Jensen? And like everybody raises their hand because we all have like 30 Hans Jensens in our family lines. Yeah. So those are the tricks, reading the records and sorting through this patronymic pot, deciding, is this my family or is this the neighbor? And who am I missing and who do I have?
Well, you tell us. We have some interesting names. So
Oh,
I have a
nice.
course guard
Okay.
and a rig trip. Are those unusual? Are
So
those
I'm going to guess
really
that's probably
common?
either Norway or Sweden. Am I right?
Oh, you know what these are? I think what happened with these names is that they had like their place or maybe their farm name added on to the end of their name
Yeah,
because this is like Peter Jensen Rigtrup.
absolutely. That was a really common practice in Norway and Sweden, which is why I
Oh,
asked. So having that farm name, and now maybe you'll see a little bit more of why the farm name can come up. Patronymics, that's such like I had said, this big giant soup pot of everybody with the same names. So in a way to kind of distinguish which Hans Jensen we're talking about, they could take that farm name and stick it on the end. So you'd still have Hans Jensen, but then whatever the name was. The neighborhood I grew up in, we had Lillenquist, Lundbergs, like all of these different names that were Swedish farm names. And that's the name that the family stuck with over generations.
okay. So one of my names is Petter Sorensen Kusk, Kusk. So I'm guessing Kusk was a farm name.
Yep.
That's so interesting. I'm so excited
Isn't
to
it?
learn that.
Jenny, I'm looking at our fan chart and we have this Danish side is filled out back to like 1729, 1760. And then we have some gaps after that for like the parents. Is it possible to go beyond like the 1720s and find the parents there?
That really depends on the church records or whatever record availability for the area. So, much like doing US research in the frontier areas, sometimes there's just not
Mhm.
records. And sometimes record books did not survive. So, if there's great parish records to 1720, then that's kind of where you're going to poop out. But I've traced lines well into the
Wow.
1500s before, too.
So there is a possibility that we could extend those lines back.
There is a possibility of extending the lines, yes.
Okay. What other records are there besides church records?
That's a great question. In Denmark and Norway, we have census records. And Norway, there's not very many of them. Denmark, there's great census records, but it's really inconsistent as to when they decided to take them every 5 years, every 10 years, or there's a 30-year gap. But those census records are fantastic. And that actually was my big key to finding this ancestress that I talked about initially, that my blog is named after. It was looking at a census record for my male ancestor before he was married to the woman that I'm descended from. And I found this other spouse and was able to kind of research out that family. But there's also great military records in Denmark. In Norway, there are books about each of these farms. So if you can find the farm, you'll be able to find the history of that farm, wherein it lists all the different families who lived there and when the farm started. And that's just a gold mine of information. And the best place to find those is just to do a Google search and find which repository has one. Of course, they'll be in Norwegian, but there's so many helps to be able to work through the language barrier on that. Sweden has built into their church records, they have essentially a census for every single year. And those would be called the householder
Oh.
indexes or the householder surveys. They have a couple different names, but that's unique to Sweden. And they are so great. You just get this chart of who the family group is and if any vital events took place over a course of years. And it usually will give you specifics about when the person was born. And there's great records if you can overcome the fear of the language.
Well, as you know, this is called the Research Like a Pro Genealogy podcast. And one of our Research Like a Pro steps is to do a locality guide. So as
Yeah.
you were talking, I was just thinking this would be so beneficial for anyone who just wants to jump in and try some Scandinavian research. That locality guide will be all important to
Yes.
learn about the locality and the
Yes.
records and time periods and everything.
For sure. And I'll just give a little plug that the family search wikis for each of the Scandinavian countries are fantastic.
Oh, good. I love the wiki. It's so helpful.
It is so helpful. It's a great starting point for anybody trying to get into something new.
All right. Well, why don't we talk about linking patterns? Because one of your posts was all about that. Actually, two. I think you had two blog posts about linking patterns. So, what do you define linking patterns as?
So when we go back to this idea of the patronymics and the kind of the disaster it is to feed into which family group do I need and which ones are not my family, we have these 6 linking patterns that can help you eliminate and kind of refine and figure out if you have the right family, if you have anybody missing, all of these. So these 6 linking patterns, I think, are essential for anyone who really wants to get into Scandinavian research.
Okay, so the first linking pattern was names, and we already talked about that. So what's the
So
next
the
one?
next one is siblings. And there's another naming pattern that comes into play with this. It holds true for all of Northern Europe, really. I would say probably for Protestant Europe, this is true, where the first two sons born are named after the grandfathers, and the first two daughters born are named after the grandmothers. So that is a great help to be able to see if you have the right family and the right children. And the subsequent children after that would be named for aunts and uncles and other important people to the family. So that's another reason why we see this very small group of given names being used over and over again. Another thing that comes into play with the siblings is that you can have the same name used over again if a child dies. So if you had a little girl and her name was Anna Maria and she died when she was like 6 months old, and then there was another girl born after that, she also might have that name of Anna Maria. So that's something to be aware of so that you don't panic and think you're grabbing extra children if you see children with the same name. It's actually just a great hint that you need to look at the burial records.
That is a good hint. Mm-hmm.
I have seen that in other countries as well. So you kind of said Northern Europe. I think I've seen
I'm
that in
sure you
Ireland and in England. And I have seen it some in the United States, not as much. But I think sometimes if there was an important name that they
Yeah.
wanted passed down, they would make sure somebody who was living had that name.
I love that cultural practice. And it's kind of a lost art that we don't name our children as significantly as our ancestors used to. And I like that.
What? You think that some of these made up names that we're using are not going to be helpful in genealogy?
I know. I say that and you think that my kids will have these like grand, majestic names. Their middle names are all very important genealogically, but their first names are just ones we liked.
Yep.
So I'm guilty as charged.
Oh, that's all right. Okay, so we've got our linking patterns. We've got, first of all, the naming patterns and then the siblings. So what is next?
The next one on the list is geography. And this kind of plays into what we had talked about before, too, of knowing the place name and pulling out that Google map and looking at distances and seeing how feasible it is. So our ancestors were not very mobile. So the family I grew up in, there's 6 children. I'm the fourth of 6 kids. And at one point, we had someone living in every time zone of North America. And I think that that is just kind of how things are today. But our ancestors weren't that way. They stayed put. When someplace that an ancestor was born, their family could have lived there for multiple generations. I have my grandfather's family, like I had mentioned before, in this little farm, Sander Ox, which is in the very northern part of Denmark. They lived there forever. So he immigrated from there, but his line can be traced clear back until the records don't exist anymore. They just didn't go anywhere. So that's one thing to remember. If you think that you're following your family jumping all around the country, that's just probably not your family. They stayed close. They may have gone a parish or two away, but they were traveling by foot and they didn't have the means or the excuse to be going far.
That's interesting. Do you ever have like a rogue person that did, like a young man who kind of would travel around?
On occasion, you will see that. Maybe if your ancestor was a soldier, you can see them bumping around a bit. I know my brother-in-law's family has that happen.
But if we're looking at whole families are not going to be uprooting and moving to another place.
Correct. Whole families really did just kind of stay where they were. You might see one person go out. I mentioned my brother-in-law with this family, and he says, "This is what I think happened." And I said, "No, that's way too much movement. There's no way." And then we were able to track down that it really was the same man, and he was a soldier and just kept moving around from place to place. But that is the
Okay.
exception. Hands down, they stayed in one spot.
That makes sense. Especially back then when travel was expensive and there wasn't a lot of communication reliable. Well, what is the next linking pattern?
Our next linking pattern has to do with property, and it's really closely related to this idea of geography and people not going anywhere. So most of our ancestors were probably rural farmers. You'll have a few that get into the cities and have a trade. And when I say rural farmers, that would include things like a blacksmith or a wheelwright or something like that. But their means of industry and employment are tied to the land. Whether our ancestors actually owned property, which very few did, or they just had the lease right to some property, that claim to land was passed from generation to generation. So that's why we see these people staying in the same place forever, because when the father died, he can pass that lease right on to the next person in line. This, of course, then brings up, well, what about the third and fourth sons? What happened to them? And they really were kind of on their own. And you will see marriages where You have a man marry a woman that's much older and widowed, and they will marry for the sake of this man being able to take over the property. And after the older woman dies, he might marry someone younger and have a family with them. Or you see marriages that just were a lot more convenient because of the land. Whatever the land situation was, people needed that property to be able to create a life for themselves.
So I was just going to ask if there are specific records. Do we have deeds or land records like we have in the U.S.?
There are land records. I would not equate them to what we have in the US. There's great probate records, and those a lot of times we'll talk about the land as well. The land records are out there, but they are a little bit trickier to get through, and they are, of course, very difficult to read. I don't use land records too often. I'll be totally honest. I think that that's something that's like super advanced, and we don't really need them. These church records will frequently talk about the location that a family lived. So it's easy to decide where they came from, where they were living. You can see where they are. I don't get too caught up in what the arrangement was with the land, if they owned, if they leased, whatever. But a lot of times in the records, the priest will say, we'll just keep using our same example, Hans Jensen, the cottager from whatever town. And that makes it pretty easy to see where they were.
Well, that's so interesting. It just goes to show that research in every location is so different.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so what is our next linking pattern after property?
Our next one is chronology. And this one I really like because you could also call this one common sense. So I firmly believe in having a timeline for our ancestors and just being able to look at the dates that we know for them. And when you look at that, you have to think, does this make sense? Do we have children being born in the right time periods? Do we have spouses that seem to be matched well in age? And this is not one of those situations where we have teenagers marrying. Scandinavian men were usually around 25 at the time of their marriage, and women were in their young 20s as well. You typically see a child being born within that first year of marriage, if not before. It's very common. These illegitimate children, super, super common. So do not panic if you see that in your family. It is not scandalous. But then children were born pretty much every 2 years. And just note, like, do we have children that are being born when the mother is very old to be having children? Or do we have them born too far after the father dies? Are they born after the mother dies? Do we have children being born every single year? If that's the case, you probably are picking up extra children because they did not have kids that close together. So this is, like I said, when we talk about common sense, you just have to think, could this really have happened? And that's what chronology is about. Does the timeline make sense?
We teach that as part of the research methodology also in any kind of research. Do things make sense? So I love that. I think that's so interesting that there was often a child born out of wedlock. Just knowing the history and knowing the culture, that makes such a difference in our research.
Yes, it does.
Okay, and then I think we've gone through 5 of our linking patterns. What is our last and final one?
Yes, so our last one is social status, or we could call this the Cinderella idea. So rags to riches didn't really happen. It makes for a great story. But if our ancestors were poor farmers, they were always poor farmers. If they had a trade, that trade was passed down from generation to generation. You didn't ever see the son of the wealthy manor lord falling desperately in love with the milkmaid and leaving the family and being disowned. And those stories are great stories, but they're just not true. So that's another thing to note. If you're starting to see, oh, Karen Christian's daughter, and she's all over the place. You know, seems like she's wealthy at one point, and then it looks like they are receiving welfare in this census record or something. You probably don't have the right family group. But this social status followed the family forever.
That's so sad, actually, isn't it?
I know, it really is.
That's probably why a lot of them emigrated, because they wanted to get out of that, whatever hole they were dug in.
Yeah, a chance to break that cycle.
I think that's not uncommon, though, in Europe. I think that was very much par for the course.
Yes, which is why everybody who came to the U.S., they were looking for the opportunity that was promised here.
Right. So let's just review the linking patterns. We had naming patterns, siblings, geographic, property, chronological, and then the social status. So I love that you have got those specific things that we can do as we're trying to do this Scandinavian research. Thank you for just laying that out so well for us.
Oh, no problem. That really is the trick. And it's not that complicated. It's family history, which is wonderful, and we find all these messy things in there. But if you can get these strong methodology patterns down, it really can help you become a strong, reliable researcher.
So do you recommend that we use those in that order? Or you like starting with the naming and then the siblings? Or do you sometimes mix those up? What is your go-to?
Yeah, I sometimes mix them up. So the naming patterns definitely are the first one because we deal with the patronymics as well as the way that the children are named. And then I think that geography and chronology are really closely related as far as importance. So I'm looking at names that line up and lock into place. And then I'm thinking, does this timeline make sense? And does the geography make sense? Are they in places at the right time that make sense for a family to be in?
So you would analyze what's out there. A lot of us have online trees, or we have trees that have been passed down, like Nicole and I with our Scandinavian research. We haven't verified it. It's just out there on Family Search or Ancestry. And so you would recommend that we take one family and then we really do the analysis. Just look at this. Do things make sense, and see what we can do. And then from that, we could do a research plan to go and try to verify or determine what's the correct lineage or something. So we really do have to analyze what's out there and figure it out.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And to be honest, that's a lot of the projects that I do. People will bring me a tree that has been around forever, that has been passed down from several generations and say, none of this has documents on it. Can you verify this for me? And that's what I do. I'll look at it and say, does this even make sense at first? And then I can usually go through and find records to either back it up or to refute it.
And that's interesting that people want to have their trees verified.
Yes. I mean, you guys know this. Anybody who's a great researcher knows a tree without sources is all hearsay. And if you're serious about having great genealogy, it's got to have sources.
Right. You just have to have the sources. Well, we're almost out of time. I wonder if you could share your experience with going to the cemetery of your ancestors' hometown as our final anecdote.
Ah, for sure. This is a fun story. So, like every overly enthusiastic hobbyist researcher, when I was first getting into this, my husband and I were young and adventurous, and we still are adventurous. We're just not so young anymore. But we went backpacking all over Scandinavia and thought, how cool, we're going to go visit some of these ancestral homelands. And he's got a lot of ancestors from Norway. Mine are centered in Denmark. But we were at this church that I had done so much research in for my family in Denmark, and thought, this is going to be great. I can't wait to get some pictures of headstones from hundreds of years ago and all this, only to find out that they only keep headstones in place for about 75 years because these churchyards have a very finite amount of space. So they kind of rotate through, and once the years are passed up and they need the space, out with the headstone, out with the body, and in with the new. So I was super disappointed and kind of shocked, but I've come to learn that that's actually pretty normal for these small parish churchyards all throughout Europe.
Makes sense. They don't have a huge yard. But it is shocking to think about because we don't do that here in the United States.
Correct. People would be up in arms over that idea.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We learned a lot. All right, go to myfavoriteancestor.com to read more from Jenny. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening today.
Thanks for having me, ladies.
Thank you, Jenny. That was super fun to have you on. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.